The war on Gaza was an issue that divided progressives intensely during the presidential election. On the one hand, many advocated trying to punish Harris and the Democrats for her and Biden's complicity with genocide. People in that camp usually suggested people vote for the Green Party's Jill Stein, but there were others who said this strategy was completely self-defeating. America has a two-party system, they'd say, and a vote for anyone other than Harris is a vote for Donald Trump. So it's really, really heated, often quite terse disputes on the progressive side of American politics. Now, in the end, the size of Trump's victory means it's hard to argue the debate made much of a difference to any of the results. In Michigan, that was the swing state with the largest Arab population in America. There were some districts where Harris was punished and the Greens did reasonably well, but statewide, Jill Stein got only 0.8%, which was half of the margin by which Harris lost to Trump. So even if all of those people who'd voted for Jill Stein had instead voted for Harris, she still would have lost. But Palestine not being a decisive issue in this election does not mean the election won't be decisive for Palestine. And Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was certainly pleased by the news of Trump's victory, posting this: Prime Minister Netanyahu, dear Donald and Melania Trump, congratulations on history's greatest comeback. Your historic return to the White House offers a new beginning for America and a powerful recommitment to the great alliance between Israel and America. This is a huge victory in true friendship. Yours, Benjamin and Sarah Netanyahu. It's clear why Netanyahu has reason to be pleased. The Middle East is unfinished business for Trump. Under his first administration, the Palestinians found themselves perhaps the most isolated they'd been in decades. And in 2020, Trump unveiled his self-named peace plan at a joint White House press conference with Netanyahu. Now, this was a disaster, shifting the conflict firmly in Israel's favor by recognizing Jerusalem as the country's capital and declaring West Bank settlements legal. The Trump plan was, naturally enough, rejected by the Palestinians and led to widespread protests in Gaza and the West Bank. But later that year, Trump also oversaw the signing of the Abraham Accords. These were agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. They were mediated by the US. And these were part of the process of normalizing relations between Israel and Arab states. The agreement saw the two countries recognize Israel's sovereignty and enabled them to establish diplomatic relations. Now, these normalization deals are highly sought after by Israel and vociferously opposed by Palestinians. Indeed, many see the Hamas attacks of 2023 as a last-ditch attempt to stop Saudi Arabia signing their version of the Abraham Accords with Israel. And what of the war on Gaza that followed October the 7th? Well, it's clear Biden and Harris were no friends to the Palestinians. But where Trump showed any opposition to them, it was only because he wanted even more undying loyalty to Israel. This was Trump at the first presidential debate, where his opponent was still Joe Biden.
As far as Israel and Hamas, Israel's the one that wants to go. He said the only one that wants to keep going is Hamas. Actually, Israel is the one, and you should let him go and let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
Trump has also been clear he wants to see Israel be even more aggressive in the wider region, saying this about attacks on Iran.
They asked him, what do you think about Iran? Would you hit Iran? And he goes, as long as they don't hit the nuclear stuff. That's the thing you want to hit, right? I said, I think he's got that one wrong. Isn't that what you're supposed to hit?
And there are signs that Trump plans to pick up where he left off. In a call with Netanyahu just 10 days before the election, Trump promised his full support for Israel's wars in Gaza and Lebanon, telling the Prime Minister to, quote, do what you have to do. Dalia, your thoughts on this? America has been had an absolutely appalling role in the Middle East this past year. And I mean, we can go way back before that, can't we? But Donald Trump probably will be even worse.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of Gaza, I do think that there is no difference actually between a Harris and a Trump presidency. It just cannot get any worse from a Gaza perspective. From a regional perspective, certainly the risk is much higher with Trump, purely because when it comes to sparking a regional war, the Democrats were not so gung-ho on things spilling out into a regional war, but they also weren't really willing to do anything to stop it happening. So they were more kind of passive participants in that. And if it came to it, they would, of course, fully support Israel in a regional war. Whereas Trump seems to be much more gung-ho when it comes to a regional war, and he's more likely to be surrounded by advisors who are going to be pushing him in that direction. We saw from his previous presidency, he is willing to go even further when it comes to erasing Palestinians off the political map. And we know that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has been a lot less present in this election campaign, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, have been less present in this campaign, but he was in the previous Trump presidency kind of the main person who was being deployed to, hilariously in a way, main person deployed to advocate for Trump's position, to represent Trump's position in the Middle East. And we know that during this genocide, Jared Kushner's contribution has been talking about the real estate possibilities in an ethnically cleansed Gaza. So it is clear, and I think that I've seen some people, some commentators saying that having this fantastical idea that somehow a Trump might be isolationist in his foreign policy, which could mean a retreat from the global stage. I think that's completely delusional. It is absolutely true that we are closer to a regional war now than we were before. And obviously that throws up the question of, and this will come through in the kind of polling afterwards, but to what extent did the complicity within the genocide in Gaza, to what extent did that shape the outcome of this election? I think most people who care about Palestine, who care about this genocide, and for whom that would have been at the forefront of their minds, know that for the region especially, things probably will be worse under a Trump presidency. And yet, can I understand why, after seeing reams and reams of footage of children's bodies shredded and hanging from buildings and people being blown up in their homes, can I understand why people simply couldn't give their vote to that? Of course I understand it. Of course I can understand why so many people felt like they couldn't vote for that. And it wouldn't have even taken that much, I think, for Harris to at least just indicate that there was a possibility of a slight departure from total complicity and enabling that marked the Biden presidency. And yet the fact that she doubled down on that and treated people protesting on behalf of Palestine with contempt and this kind of shaming tactic, this disparaging tactic, which is just so characteristic of centrism, of left centrism now, that couldn't have helped her. And so we really are in a very, very dire situation where American people, many of whom will have increased in their solidarity for the Palestinian cause over the past year. Again, they had absolutely no outlet, absolutely no candidate serious candidate that could even represent a mild departure from that status quo. And so is it worse? 100% it's worse. But unfortunately, the lack of alternative, the lack of any serious alternative meant that we are in this situation where, once again, because we live in a world that is governed by US empire, unfortunately, this election has not only been disastrous for Americans, but it has been disastrous for the whole world. And so, yeah, I mean, it's devastating. From a Gaza perspective, nothing much is going to change, I don't think, because it cannot get worse than it already is. But in terms of the broader region, we are looking at some very, very risky years ahead of us.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that analysis. I mean, it's sort of on those long-term questions about sort of annexation and then also relations with Iran, where Donald Trump is quite different to, I think, a Harris administration would have been. But it's not going to make much difference if you're on the ground in Gaza, because if you're suffering a genocide, it can't get much worse, right? I think Donald Trump will openly support it in a way. I think he whereas sort of like the Democrats sort of say we're trying to tell him to respect human rights. I don't think Trump will bother with any of that. He'll say let them get the job done, right? And presumably that. Yeah, I imagine actually that could have a material effect, but it's marginal because it's already so close to as bad as it can be.
And what I would say is I can also understand, and I've seen some sense of, and I come from an Arab family. I'm in touch with a lot of Arabs both in the US and here. There is a sense that we wanted to punish the Democrats. We wanted to show it because no other way that we've been trying to show you that we care about this issue, that Arab lives are important, that they're not just disposable, that Palestinian lives are important. Every other mechanism we've tried to show to exercise that voice has been strangled. And so it felt like the only opportunity to say there is going to be a price to pay for that. And I wish that I could join in that sense of schadenfreude, but unfortunately, the Democrats are going to learn nothing from this. In fact, what they're going to do is they're going to turn around and they're going to blame Arab and Muslim voters for voting against their own interests. Well, you didn't represent their interests to begin with. So who could they vote for in order to represent their interests? So we're going to see a lot of that blaming. We're going to see a lot of that scapegoating. And once again, a refusal to question whether or not actually was I the right person for the job? Is this ongoing commitment to preserving the status quo a winning strategy? They're never going to ask that question. They're never going to learn that lesson. They're just going to find a way to blame Arabs and Muslims who had no other way to exercise the fact that they care about this issue and this issue is important. They had no other way to exercise it. And so they exercised it, unfortunately, in some cases here. The consequences are not going to be any better, but many felt like they were left with no other choice.
Well, I mean, as I said, I think the size of Trump's win means that we will be spared some of those arguments. I mean, I think if Michigan had been a dead heat and the Electoral College was closer, then everyone would have been talking about the few thousand votes that Jill Stein got and saying this was the fault of Muslims or Arabs who couldn't be sensible enough to vote for the Democrats. But I think because it wasn't close, we will hear less of that. Let's go to some updates from the Middle East, from Israel. There were some political changes in Israel this week as well. And it does appear that whatever its outcome, Netanyahu appeared emboldened by the United States elections, or at least saw them as an excuse to put out some news that the Americans might not be so pleased about. Hours before voting began, he fired his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, citing a lack of trust and a cracked relationship between the two men. In earlier statements, Netanyahu had also accused Gallant of being insufficiently committed to Israel's war goals. While Americans were voting, mass protests at Gallant's sacking broke out across Israel, with protesters in Tel Aviv calling for an end to the Netanyahu regime. In Gallant's place, Netanyahu has now appointed his hardline ally, Israel Katz. Again, it's one of those situations where it's very difficult to sort of say, oh no, Gallant has been sacked. No, Gallant was the guy who was saying, let's have a complete siege on Gaza, don't let any food or water in. But the reason Netanyahu has sacked him is because he wants someone even more extreme in post. I mean, it's very similar to the American situation. There is very little, ways in which one could say that the Democrats did a decent job when it came to Gaza, but Netanyahu is celebrating Trump because he's even worse. Right? So this is a very depressing situation.